Hi. So this is a video made in conjunction with And Roses 2, a reading and study group for leftist theory. This video isn't really meant to replace the source material, which currently is this book, Capitalism and Disability by Marta Russell, edited by Keith Rosenthal. Rather, it's really meant to condense ideas into a more accessible format and maybe spark some discussion. So please keep that in mind. Given that, I am going to be doing a kind of short video for our first meeting about this book. I actually literally just went over the introduction of the book because I feel like it's a really dense introduction that sets up several paradigms that we just need to keep in mind throughout the rest of the book. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the writer and editor, and then I'm going to dive right into that. So, all right. So, firstly, Marta Russell. So, Marta Russell was born in 1951 and she passed in 2013. She had cerebral palsy her entire life, and was very active in the disability activism sphere towards later in her life, like beginning in the 80s mostly. Um, she initially went to school for art, so she went to the Memphis College of Art and then the American Film Institute, and then she worked as a graphic and visual effects designer. She actually worked on the movie Tron. Um, and then she kind of transitioned into working for the ACLU and ADAPT, which I'll talk about a little bit later. I know you all know what the ACLU is, but you might not know what ADAPT is. She was eventually awarded the City of Los Angeles Commission on Disabilities Award in 1994, and she became the co-producer of the documentary "Disabled and the Cost of Saying I Do" which came out in 1995, which is actually completely free available on her website, and I highly recommend watching it. And she published all of the writings in this text as individual essays, and then Keith Rosenthal kind of went back and not really edited the text itself, but collated them into a cohesive book that made sense, and chose order and stuff. So Keith Rosenthal is that's the editor that did that, is a writer and activist who focuses on capitalism, revolution, disability. He's a frequent contributor to the International Socialist Review, and he edited this and eventually published it in 2019, so 6 years after she died. I also wanted to note his editor's note about statistics. So he talks about, he says, Marta Russell was at her most prolific between the years of 1998 and 2005, and all of the pieces found in this book are dated from that period. Thus, much of the specific topical data and statistics she posits are from 15 to 20 years ago. However, upon cross-referencing current and updated figures, I've decided to leave it untouched as in the original. And I thought that it was just important to note this because I'm also going to not be updating the statistics when I do mention statistics. I don't think there are any in this introductory video, but there will be in later chapters. And yeah, the statistics are from between 98 and 05. And the reason that he chose not to update them is A, they haven't changed, but also there are some times where the statistics have changed, but the trend that they are showing has continued to trend in the same direction. So the statistics continue to illustrate the same points. And also this isn't like a, work about statistics. This is a work that uses statistics to demonstrate some posited theory. So I think it's more important to focus on the posited theory because it is all still applicable, even if the numbers themselves are slightly different today. All right. So firstly, I want to talk a little bit about models of disability, diving into the text. So one of the most common models of disability that you're going to hear about is the medical model. And that's been the predominant model for a really long time. People are trying to replace it with the social model because the social model is, at least in my view, a little bit better for disabled people. But I just kind of want to go through what these different models mean. So the medical model views disability as something that needs to be diagnosed or cured. So it's really from a medical perspective. It's very useful medically and legally. So coming up with specific diagnoses and stuff, this is the way to categorize, illnesses or differences, um, very, very like logically and methodically. I'm not saying that's like a good or bad thing to do, but if you're looking to categorize things medically and legally, this is the model you're probably going to be using. It really individualizes difficulties that disabled people face, and it can create super exacting standards that require people to prove disability in order to receive assistance, accommodation, or treatment. So it's not it's good as a framework for trying to figure out like what what treatment you might need for something or what accessibility device you might benefit from, but it's not great socially because it really individualizes disabilities and makes them something that are like a very personal problem that you need to fix about yourself as opposed to a problem that needs accommodations. Um, so the social model of disability kind of combats that. It views disability as a condition created by bad social design, emphasizes the human right to participate in society, and encourages creative and inclusive designs and spaces. So this kind of reframes, like, as opposed to saying like, oh, if someone's in a wheelchair, like they've just got to figure out how to make their life work around that. It's saying like, well, there are people who need wheelchairs, so we should make spaces wheelchair accessible. Like it's that kind of frame shifting. Some people argue that it de-emphasizes finding cures for things people might actually want cures for, right? So there's different types of disabilities. There's types of disabilities where people are like, no, this is just how my body is and that's fine. I don't want to change it. And then there's types of, there's illnesses that can be disabling that people really do want to find a way to change, because it's not so much part of them as something that's happening to them. It's like there's a spectrum here. So some of those things that people really do want cures for, and that are curable, might be better to qualify in a medical model, and some things that are just more innate to a person are maybe better to qualify in a social model. And then I also want to touch on the tragedy charity model. This isn't necessarily mentioned in Russell's book, or this introduction at least, but I think it's really important because we just had Autism Awareness Month in April, and we always have to hear about Autism Speaks. So every time I mention like tragedy charity model, please think of Autism Speaks. So this views disability as unfortunate or inspirational. It inspires a lot of fundraising, assistance projects, and nonprofits. And a lot of disabled people find it really condescending or dehumanizing. So in some ways, this model can seem really good at first. This is the kind of thing where people are like, oh, we're doing a fun run to raise $5,000 to find a cure for autism or whatever. And that like maybe sounds good at first, but then when you kind of, I'm using Autism Speaks as my example, but when you kind of delve deeper into that, there's very, very few actually autistic people that want a cure for autism. And the tragedy charity model tends to really overlook disabled people's perspectives and instead try to find ways to like kind of pedestalize disabled people and create social causes around them that they may not want or even be a part of. So then I want to kind of posit the model that Russell is going to use, which I am calling Russell's socioeconomic model. She does not use the word socioeconomic model, but I just think that that is an easier term to use for it. And I feel like that kind of like captures what she's getting at. So she has a quote about it in her introduction where she says, "We take the view that disability is a socially created category derived from labor relations, a product of the exploitative economic structure of capitalist society, one which creates and then oppresses the so-called disabled body as one of the conditions that allow the capitalist class to accumulate wealth." And also in that like section, she has another quote that says, "As production became industrialized, people's bodies were increasingly valued for their ability to function like machines." So she's kind of bringing in this idea that, yes, the social model is close, but social relations in and of themselves are not what create disability. It's social and economic relations. And she's going to really stress that economic relations piece and the way that economic relations shape social relations throughout this book. So then another thing that she talks about that's important to mention here is the benefit system. So it's not enough money to live on, but it's a way that, we've now created this problem of like disabled people are maybe not a part of the capitalist workforce. um, how is that to be solved under capitalism? And so the benefit system is a proposal to that, and it kind of ends up allowing capitalists to dispense with disabled workers without feeling the moral qualm of like, I'm responsible for giving this person a way to make a living, because they can pass them off to the benefit system where they will be like, quote unquote, taken care of by the government. We all know that the benefit system is like never enough money to live on. But um yeah. So, sorry, I should have grabbed like a water before I started this. American business retains its power over the working class through a fear of destitution that would be weakened if the safety net became actually safe. So I thought this was a really important piece of her argument. And it not only frames how the like capitalist economy impacts disabled people themselves, but it also kind of frames this idea that even perfectly abled workers can be threatened by the idea of you have to keep working, you have to maintain participation in capitalism, or you will fall into this quote unquote safety net. And if the safety net worked, people wouldn't be scared of falling into the safety net, but it doesn't work. And so not only does it like fuck over disabled people, but it also maintains fear in able-bodied workers. Um, and then lastly, I think this is lastly, I want to talk about disability rights movements. Briefly, I'm going to talk about like kind of three different models of them, and just kind of talk about what works and where are the pitfalls, and a little bit about the work that Russell actually did. So NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and nonprofits. I talked about these a little earlier with Autism Speaks, but these really tie into the tragedy charity model. They're more frequently run by non-disabled people than they are by disabled people, when it comes to things that are supposed to like specifically be for disability. And even when they are run by disabled people, their ability to criticize government policies is greatly impeded because they usually rely on government funding through grants. Um, and even just to get your, to file status as a nonprofit organization, you need to kind of sign off on some qualifications of you won't do anything against the government in some ways. So they're incredibly limited, and they're often really built into that tragedy charity model. Obviously, like there are nonprofits that have good services, but on the whole, nonprofits tend to create a very short-term solution that ultimately perpetuates the larger capitalist system by allowing it to kind of like continue without people falling all the way to the bottom and being like, we have to revolt. Um, and I think further in the future, we will probably do an entire like group on this book, but I wanted to say if you have more like, if you really want more information on nonprofits, I highly recommend Gay Inc. by Merle Beam. It talks about nonprofitization from a queer perspective, but I think that the critiques Beam makes of nonprofits are just as relevant in a disability perspective, and the information is just as useful. Okay, then I want to talk a little about the independent living movement. So this was started by disabled students in Berkeley, California. Kind of redefined inaccessibility and other disability issues as social and political rather than personal, and kind of tied into consciousness raising groups that were doing that in the women's movement, also in Berkeley at the time. Um, and it really like framed, so it like really reframed disability into the social model. This is kind of the beginning of the social model taking off. Um, However, it also really framed disabled people as consumers. So one of the things you might hear people recommend for independent living is like doctor shopping, which is this idea of like, doctor shopping gets used in a lot of contexts, but one context that it gets used in is if you are going to this doctor and they're like treating you terribly and like not listening to your pain or whatever, like then just simply see a different doctor and like don't give, you're paying for these doctors, so don't give them your money if they're not treating you properly, right? Like if you were to go to a restaurant that had terrible service, you would then take your business to a different restaurant the next time you ate out or whatever. And so it's this idea of kind of shopping around the medical industry and treating it the same way. And this is really empowering to disabled people with money, right? So not all people can doctor shop. And also it works better in larger cities, right? If you're in a very rural area, you may have access to one or two doctors, and if they're both bad, you don't really have the choice to just be like, yeah, I'll just drive like hundreds of miles away to go to a third doctor. Um, and also by doing this and by setting up this like we're making our choices by where we put our money, it implicitly kind of accepts free market ideology and thus capitalism. Um, However, I sound really critical of independent living, and I have like my like further reading book on it is Venus on Wheels by Galia Frank, and I highly recommend that book. I think that the woman that book highlights is an amazing activist. I just think that independent living has some shortcomings. All right, so lastly, I want to talk about civil disobedience and some organizations that have kind of like highlighted this in the disability sphere. Oh my God, are League for the Physically Handicapped, Disabled in Action, and American Disabled for Accessible Public Transit, or ADAPT, which is that organization that Marta Russell worked with. So this involves, I mean, you're familiar with civil disobedience in other contexts, I'm sure, but this involves like more militant protest tactics. One of the things ADAPT did was demonstrations or disruption of public transit that led to mass arrests. And these movements were more frequently affiliated with like labor unions or famously some of these actions have been like coordinated and supported by the Black Panther Party. um, and so their civil disobedience model of resistance tends to, I'm not going to say that it necessarily is a more intersectional model because I don't think that's true, but I think that historically it has really tended to lend itself to intersectionalism much better and align itself with other movements much better. All right. Yeah, and then I think I've got one more quote from her. So they kind of talk about the movement being still individualized, even the things that ADAPT was doing. So ultimately, even the most grassroots disability organizations in both the US and Britain appear theoretically ambiguous in their ideological formulations. They have yet to adopt an anti-capitalist agenda that sees disablement as a product of the class system. Um, so that last, like, I know I'm on discussion questions now, but essentially what Russell is posing is that we really need to use a socioeconomic model of disability. And she's kind of positing A, that fourth model of disability, and B, what does resistance look like if your model of disability necessarily involves the economy, right? Then are you resisting capitalism in order to fight for disability rights, etc. Not going to go over these discussion questions, but they're up on the screen. So these are things we may talk about in the group. And if you're not part of the group, but you're just watching this on YouTube, cool. You're welcome to talk about them in the comments, but I do not have any sort of plan to respond to YouTube comments. I'm going to post a link to join the Discord that actually facilitates this reading group, and maybe you can come to meetings if you really want to talk about it. Yeah, my intention in creating the group was really to facilitate discussion outside of like internet comment sections, because I don't think that usually ends up being a very productive place for discussion. So that's my hope. Yeah.